Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. Our guest today is James Fishback, the head of macro, but officially the co-founder and CIO of Azoria Partners and the founder of Incubate Debate. James, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Nick. It's important to caveat the officially versus the unofficially, right? But the unofficial, you seem to be known by, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing that comes up more often than not.
It seems that way. And for those who don't know James' story and the head of macro, that you basically just need to type that into Google or X, and you'll have an interesting 20 minutes of research of learning about that backstory.
Yeah, you know what's funny? My mom sent me the ChatGPT screenshots. I think it does a pretty good job of that too. That type in head of macro controversy and it gets you caught up to speed in 90 seconds or less.
I love it. Well, I figured actually that would be a good place to start. It's been a while. Occasionally, we have finance professionals, investors come on the show and talk about their views on the economy. And it's been a while since we had someone like you, and so here we are in early September of 2024. This big election. The Federal Reserve is sort of on its way to pivoting, or I guess it's already pivoting. Why don't we just talk about your macro view for a few minutes? What do you think's going on?
There's so much going on. There's obviously a ton of price volatility right now as we speak. The S&P is down 80, 90 points on the day. That's almost pennies in comparison to what happened in early August when the VIX went from 15 to 65 in just a couple of days. The market was down, Nick, not 9% on the day or the week, but 9% from all-time highs. And it was like there was blood in the street. So there's plenty of price volatility to move around. The price of stocks and bonds are moving all over. But what I think there's even more volatile these days is what I call narrative volatility. The story seems to keep changing. It keeps whipsawing about what kind of economy we're in, what the Fed is set to do, and how the markets are set to respond to it. Let's not forget that we started the year off, Nick, where the market was saying definitively there was going to be 7 rate cuts from the Fed. 7 rate cuts. In fact, in January, the Fed funds futures market was saying that as you and I are sitting here on September 2nd, 2024, that the Fed funds rate would be 70 basis points lower than it actually is today. It hasn't been cut at all. And yet the market was saying in January it was going to be 70 basis points lower. The narrative keeps changes. Now, of course, the 7 rate cuts that were asserted by the market in January were quickly unwound as we got hotter than expected inflation in those first 3 months of the year. And now we've settled back into this idea that the Fed is going to be cutting and cutting quite aggressively. I think the Fed is absolutely going to be cutting. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when, not even when actually, because it seems like September, obviously, in just a couple weeks. But it's actually a question now, Nick, of to what extent the Fed is going to cut. So as we sit here today, the market's saying the Fed's going to cut by 200 basis points. And there's plenty of stocks that have solely risen on the expectation of imminent aggressive Fed rate cuts. And so I warn investors, if you've got stocks in your portfolio that you believe have only gone up because of a shot of heroin that might be coming down the pike from the Fed, beware of those holdings. There are plenty of high quality companies, think Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, and Apple, who are going to do well whether the Fed takes rates to 0 or takes them all the way to 15%. And so look for businesses that have strong competitive advantages, that are free cash flow generative, and are largely immune to the macro picture, because the narrative volatility in that macro picture is really aggressive these days. And so we obviously have an election. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that in some detail in terms of the policies between Vice President Harris and President Trump. But in terms of macro, I would just say this: we're living in volatile times, and the highest form of volatility isn't just the price of assets. It is the narrative around those assets. And the best piece of advice, and one I need to take seriously myself as I think about markets, is don't get lulled by the story. Don't get persuaded by the story of the day. It was the Psalm rule this time last month where the markets threw this total temper tantrum and there was an imminent recession. I'm not a big fan of betting in prediction markets. I think they're fascinating. I don't do a ton of betting there. Obviously, my work is at a hedge fund like Azoria, and the ETFs that we're going to launch next year centers around listed liquid markets. But just to give you an idea, there's a specific way you could bet on recession probability. And the day, Nick, that jobs report came down in early August, the market was saying there was a 40% chance of a recession between now and the end of the year. Mind you, a recession means, by their definition, 2 negative quarters of GDP growth. That probability today, that same exact market, is now at 9%. So yeah, 40 to 9 is a lot of vol, but what's even more vol is the underlying narrative that the market just keeps swinging for like a pendulum aggressively back from one end to another. And so beware of that narrative volatility is what I'd have to say.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's something that I can relate to. I'm in real estate, and so I've been tracking this narrative volatility. I love that phrase for several years because first it was the soft landing, then it's the no landing, then it's the hard landing. Like we keep kind of going back and forth, and as in my sector, everyone's in deep pain. Like we
Yeah.
basically, people who are like solely real estate players, they can't really even understand what's happening or why we haven't had a recession because it's been so challenging for several years for investors and developers. But yet the market continues to rage forward on the backs of other narratives like AI is going to solve all our problems or whatever that may be. But in my world, it's been tough, and it sort of looks like it's getting better. Like this recent reduction in interest rates has helped, but it's still tough out there. What do you think of this? There was a big piece of news a few weeks ago where the BLS revised the jobs number to show something like 800,000 jobs disappeared, or 800,000 jobs they said had happened didn't happen. What is your take on that piece of data?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I'm fascinated by your world too in real estate because there's a ton of narrative all there. I remember the spring of 2020, New York's dead, right? And then there was this idea that everyone's going to come back to work, and then CRE was going to come back, and so there's again on both ends of that, whether it's the euphoria or whether it's the outright panic, there's some narrative vol, and it's worth fading those extremes. There's another phenomenon, if we're going to coin some terms, that I call the headline bias. And so the headline bias, you bring up this question about the 800,000 revisions that the Bureau of Labor Statistics put out earlier this month. So there's two questions there. One, is the job market overstating the strength of the economy? The answer unequivocally is yes, in large part because many of the jobs that you and I are seeing created every single month in those official stats are actually going to illegal migrants that are crossing the border and are being quickly handed jobs via work authorizations and mass paroles that are given by the Biden administration. So that's one thing that doesn't reflect the accurate strength of the job market. But the specific question you asked, Nick, about the 800,000, there's a really interesting quirk about how they answer that question. Let me tell you the conclusion first and then get to the outcome or how we got there. The conclusion is that number actually overstates the weakness that we see in that particular report. And the reason why is that every year the Bureau of Labor Statistics tries to mend the gap between the official stats that they put out every month and then this revision. And the way they do that is by looking at the unemployment claims data that are published by the states. And so the idea is that if the unemployment claims data somehow can't reconcile with the official jobs data, that a revision is in order. The problem is that the companies that are self-reporting this don't count undocumented workers, illegal workers, in this equation. And so when they look at this and they say, hold on a second, all this job growth is due to undocumented, but we're not seeing that reflected in the claims data. Why not? Because undocumented workers don't receive unemployment insurance in the vast majority of states, and then these companies wouldn't be incentivized to report that data because they don't receive it. That gap was reflected largely in that 800,000. So now, was there a revision of the negative variety? Absolutely. There's data that I've seen, research that I've seen, and our own independent work at Azoria that suggests it was probably close to 250 or 350,000 of a negative revision, but not the 800,000. And historically, by the way, if you look at this, there's the first release of the revision and the second release often corrects the record and ends up bridging the gap even more. And so I'm of the view that the aggregate economic statistics are actually holding in really well. The issue that we're having is what's called a K-shaped recovery. Right after COVID, what ended up happening was Americans who owned assets, who are cash rich, who owned their homes, who were locked into their mortgages, they were the upward trajectory of the K, and they kept doing better. And those at the lower end who bore the brunt of the crippling inflation that we haven't seen in 40 years, they don't own their homes, they rent, they're paycheck to paycheck. They don't benefit from low fixed interest rates in the way that you or I might. And their lives have progressively gotten worse. And so to the question, what does the economy look like today? Well, the aggregate statistics tell you one story, and it's not a question of them being rigged, although there are serious issues with the methodology. Think of it this way, Nick. The top fifth of income earners in America, the top fifth, they represent just the top fifth, 40% of all consumption in America. The bottom fifth represent 9%. So we say one person, one vote. Thank God for that, by the way. But when it comes to the economy, one person does not equal one vote, does not equal one contribution or one vote into the question, is the economy good? Is it working well? And so everyone says, well, how is it that people are struggling, that single moms in places like Cincinnati or Coeur d'Alene or Baltimore are struggling with high inflation? And yet the economic data as measured in aggregate has really never been better. Let's be honest. It's never really been better. It's because those low-income Americans have very little weight in determining what those aggregate statistics end up showing. And so the top fifth, what do? They own stocks. They own NVIDIA. They own Google. They own the S&P. They've got money in a money market mutual fund, Nick, that's earning 4.5%, 5%, pretty much doing nothing, where low-income Americans are working at record numbers, multiple jobs to keep up with high prices. We think of inflation like Americans think of inflation, this idea that, hey, stuff's more expensive. But it turns out that academics, when they say inflation, the technically correct expert term is price level changes as a second order derivative. The price level going up 5% and then staying there over a year means that inflation was 5% in year one and 0% in year two. But the way Americans think about it when they go to the grocery store is, crap, things are more expensive today, 25, 35, 45 more expensive today than they were 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm upset and I'm pissed. And so I think that's the real issue at play here. There's political dynamics that end up contributing to, I think, we'll talk, I'm sure, about the election and what that means for that. But just to give you a read of it, you talked about the 800,000 figure, a little bit of a quirk, but I think it speaks to the larger issue that aggregate economic data does not reflect economic reality anymore.
Yeah, it seems that way for sure. I mean, you raise a very good point, and one that we've talked a lot about on the show, which is this sort of this two Americas, the wealth inequality. But it really is true. It's statistically true, and it's definitely sort of anecdotally true. Like if you have assets, you live in a different America,
right,
than those who don't, and it's a starkly different America, and unfairly so. And it's been, many guests have come on here and they blamed, the Fed for this, going back to the, Greenspan Fed. What's your take on that? Like the underlying cause of the two Americas, where do you fall in this?
It's scary territory, because anytime you talk about inequality, people are going to assume that you're advocating for some kind of wealth distribution plan, right? Which is kind of what Vice President Harris wants to do. But I think we can talk about this honestly without leaning one way or another. I'm an unapologetic conservative, so what I'm about to say might upset some of the rhinos and the country club Republicans in my own party. But we do have a problem in this country. I don't think it's solved by punishing wealthy Americans. I don't think that the Fed, honestly, has much of a role to play in any of this. And why? Because to believe, Nick, that the Fed has played a role in widening this inequality, you would have to believe that the Fed gets credit for the 10 to 12% annualized returns in the S&P 500. You'd have to believe that the Fed gets credit for the fact that NVIDIA is up 150% this year and much the same last year. And so which one is it? Right. I know that most libertarians and conservatives who would make the argument and wag their finger at, Jerome Powell and then Janet Yellen and then Bernanke before her and Greenspan before him. But which one is it? The Fed is responsible for all of this incredible asset appreciation in the economy, or the Fed is not responsible for it? Because if you believe that they're not responsible, you cannot simultaneously argue that the wealthy have gotten wealthier because of owning assets. Assets have done well because over time, not over the course of a couple weeks or months, but over time, assets reflect fundamental values, economic fundamentals and corporate fundamentals, which have remained strong in the US. I think largely because despite some setbacks here and there, we can talk about the DEI infringements in legislation like the CHIPS Act and what President Biden has done with crippling regulation. But by and large, the US economy is an economy that subscribes to shareholder capitalism, unapologetic pursuit of profit. That's a good thing. Greed, as we learned from that movie in the 80s, right? Wall Street, greed is a good thing. Of course, you should observe social norms and the law, obviously. But within that, greed is a good thing. Europe, on the other hand, Nick, has thrown in the towel on shareholder capitalism and has resorted to a soft form of socialism called stakeholder capitalism. That no, the shareholder is actually a co-partner to the climate activist named Greta Thunberg, who wants to dismantle all of nuclear energy despite not being able to utter one coherent sentence about why nuclear is bad. It actually is a co-partnership with her, with the worker, with the labor union, with the K through 12 school, and so on and so forth. And what Milton Friedman and many others have said, and this is empirically true, is that if you do right by the shareholder, if you make the best product and sell that product, that everything else, the free market, will largely take care of everything else. And to the extent, Nick, that there are externalities like, oh, I don't know, creative destruction, like your competitors being bankrupted, that is a good thing. As Joseph Schumpeter taught us in the 1940s, that Austrian economist who coined that phrase, saying, look, capitalism is both a story of love and a story of destruction, a story of creation and a story of elimination. And so to all of this, I would say, yeah, the rich have gotten richer, but the working class, low-income Americans aren't going to be any better off if they take away half of what Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk has made. I mean, if you want to fix inequality, inequality is very simply a denominator and a numerator. The numerator is the wealth of Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and the like, and the denominator is the wealth of the bottom, call it 10%. If you want to shrink and make inequality less, all you got to do is chop the numerator in half and take the money from the wealthy, which Vice President Harris is arguing for with this proposal of a unrealized capital gains tax. Make no mistake, that is a pure play retribution and punishment for the wealthy, and it's going to expand in scope just as income tax did originally in the early 20th century. And so to all of this, I say, no. To say that the Fed is responsible for inequality is to, one, say that inequality is a problem in and of itself. I'm more concerned with low-income Americans not making enough than I am with, I mean, we all should be, with wealthy Americans making too much. You know, you heard former First Lady Michelle Obama at the DNC said she was always skeptical of folks who took more than they needed. Well, what about her house in Martha's Vineyard? You know, the 12,000 square feet. What about that house in Hawaii? What about the house not too far from me in DC in Kalorama, right? She's taken, by her own definition, more than she's needed. Let's focus on Americans who are working, trying to get by, but just can't seem to. And there's a lot of reasons why. And it doesn't actually have to do with the failure of capitalism. I actually think that to the extent that capitalism is failing, it's because government interference needs to get out of the way and let real capitalism do its job.
Yeah. So in that line of thinking, bailing out the banks in 08, 09, and all these other firms that got bailed out may have not been the right policy decision at the time.
Absolutely. Total mistake. Total mistake. And by the way, I mean, you could argue that there's some element of asset appreciation in there, right? If the banks would have gone to zero, folks holding those banks today, like Citi, for example, that stock would be zero, the equity structure would have gotten wiped out. But let's be honest, the banks have not driven the rally in the S&P 500 over the past decade. And so absolutely, I think if you're pro-worker, you have to be, if you're pro-capitalism, you have to be against bailouts in any form. That runs from corporate bailouts for reckless banks all the way down to a safety net in this country that actually disincentivizes work. The safety net, Nick, started off as really this idea that, hey, if you're down on your luck, if you're out of work, we're gonna build a bridge for you to get to the other side of this canyon so you can get back on your feet to support your family and your community. And that's why you pay into the system with taxes to do that. It was a safety net, then it became a safety couch, then it became the safety Tempur-Pedic, and now it's the safety jacuzzi. The safety net needs to be not even a net, it's got to be a trampoline. When you hit it, you bounce back on your feet, you take a little bit of aid, and then you get back to doing what you do best, whether that's a nurse, whether that's a firefighter, whether you're a teacher or a bus driver or a small business owner or a paralegal or even a head of macro. You take that little bit of aid and you bounce and get back up on your feet. I don't want to hand out. Most Americans, working class that I talk to, don't want to hand out either. And so if they don't get handouts, if they don't get long-term disincentivizing safety net aid, neither should the big banks who take reckless decisions. They want all the profits when times are good. And the second things hit the fan, guess what? Their bets go sour and they want the government to bail them out. And I know, by the way, that that's an unpopular position, again, in some elements of the country club segment of the Republican Party. It does not matter. I am a capitalist before I'm a Republican. I'm an American before I'm a Republican. And to that, I say, no one gets bailouts. No one gets bailouts. Let the system work. And that system is unbridled capitalism. Everyone benefits from that in the long run.
Yeah. Well, couple follow-ups on that, because I find it super interesting, intriguing line of thinking. For the longest time, I was in the camp that the Federal Reserve's actions over the last several decades was, one of the, if not the biggest cause of all this wealth inequality. Mm-hmm. But I've been thinking recently, and it sounds like you may be on the same page, is that the sort of liquidity bid that's been existent in the US for whatever is causing our stock market to outperform might actually be a function of something else, which is that we just happen to be a better place for investment dollars.
That's
and
right.
If you think about that 20-year period, right? Like all these countries have moved to authoritarianism, or in the case of Europe, as you eloquently laid out, they've gone, further and further down the opposite direction of capitalism in the way that they're pursuing their economy. And so one thought is that, gosh, maybe the US is actually just the best place on planet Earth for investment dollars, which is a great story. And I hope that, I hope it's right.
It's a great story, and it's true. Elon Musk's story, and he himself admits this, would not have been possible in his home country of South Africa. Steve Jobs' story as an immigrant from the Middle East would not have been possible in Syria. And you can go down the list. And so I think it's the US, for just a whole host of reasons, labor network effects, especially in Silicon Valley, lends itself to this type of innovation and growth. And just because the Fed happens to participate in that system doesn't mean that all of this growth, all of this appreciation is happening because of the Fed. It's largely happening in spite of, right? Despite what the Fed is doing. But, at the same time, it doesn't mean that there isn't more dismantling to go. We have a ton of regulation on the books that doesn't just stymie the likes of Tesla or Microsoft, but even local entrepreneurs. Think about this. It wasn't until earlier this year, Nick, that in the state of Louisiana, you couldn't stand up a flower shop unless you had passed a testing requirement in the state. Think about it. You couldn't sell roses and lilies unless you passed a written test, filled out all the forms in Louisiana. Now, look, what do we call that? That's protectionism. That is the florist lobby erecting barriers to shield itself from mom and pop competitors who, by the way, might have been in the oil industry, might have been a teacher, might have been a firefighter, only to have left that career to start something new, maybe because they were found unemployed, out of work, to start something new, only to find that the government, that crony capitalism, that these occupational licenses, which is just anti-worker regulation, ended up stymieing them. And so we got to dismantle the regulatory complex from the top down, but especially from the bottom up, because it's workers who often, whether it's non-compete agreements, as a hedge fund guy, I can understand why they exist in places like the top hedge funds where you're looking at specific, sophisticated quantitative investment strategies that, for obvious reasons, billionaire hedge funds don't want replicated by their competitors. But I think, when you talk about fast food workers and service workers and security guards, oftentimes many of them, hundreds of thousands of low-income workers, are bound to these non-compete agreements. And so obviously I look at what Lena Khan has done with the FTC. I disagree, obviously, with the overreach that they've done, and the courts have as well, that this type of FTC decree that all non-competes are null and void is obviously unlawful. But we should have an honest conversation at the state and federal level about the pervasiveness of these non-compete agreements. It's just one example of how regulation is holding us back. If you want to start a business, if you want to start a floral company because there's not enough competition in your town, if you think you have a better way to harvest these flowers, to grow them, to present them, you should not have government and big business working in concert, holding you back and denying you the right to make a living in America.
Yeah. I want to get into the regulatory state in a minute, but I want to close the loop on this macro stuff for a second. The other thing I was thinking as you were just answering the question about the Fed is that you brought up the recent tax proposal, which is calling for like a pretty substantial tax on unrealized capital gains, which I think is absurd. And I think most Americans honestly think it's absurd. Certainly all the people that are on the upper part of the K are against that policy. And part of me thinks that policy, this is a little bit pessimistic, but part of me thinks that is floated as a sort of disingenuous election tactic. Like, hey, this will look good to the base if we say we're going to tax unrealized capital gains, and then they're never going to actually do it. I hope that's the case because it's really nonsense. But it got me thinking about the bigger problem. Like the media loves to point out the fortunes of these people like Musk and Bezos and whatnot. But what they don't talk about is the fact that CEOs over the last 30 years of publicly traded companies that sort of already went 0 to 1 and became these big multinational corporations, their pay has just gone crazier and crazier. And so if you think about like Jamie Dimon is like making as much money as Elon in a given year, which makes no sense, right? He's just running an institution that's basically government protected, and he's not adding the same kind of value. But when we sort of attempt to demonize wealth, we don't talk about the Jamie Dimons of the world. We're talking about Elon and Bezos and the tech entrepreneurs. I find that interesting. What's your take on that?
You're absolutely right. And there's a question of demonization here of why would you want to cast aspersions on someone for making it, right? It's like this American dream is sold to us. You can do it. You can do it. Keep striving for it. Keep working hard. And the second you cross into the I made it category, what did you do? Why did you do that? Right? Why did you do that? What billionaires, as some on the left argue, on the radical left, really, a billionaire shouldn't be able to exist, they argue, that you shouldn't even be able to amass that kind of wealth. Let's not forget, though, that it was just a few weeks ago that vice presidential candidate and Governor Tim Walz called out J.D. Vance from a podium and said that I grew up with a lot of guys in the Midwest like J.D., and none of them went off to Yale, casting him out for being a kid who grew up in Appalachia, who grew up with a mom who struggled with addiction, who went on to the Marine Corps, who went on to Ohio State, and then made it all the way to Yale Law School, to somehow demonize him for making it. And so that's just one example in politics, but the many you bring up, whether that is Elon Musk, whether that is Tim Cook or whomever, I think the big bank CEOs are highly overrated because they're essentially government utilities and they're being paid much like a government worker would. I mean, their entire business is largely backed by the federal government. They're so-called the systemically important banks, right? The GSIBs. And so I don't know that they should be receiving, but that's a question, I guess, for the shareholders. Right. I think that their pays are largely overrated, but I'm not here to say that, it's too little or too much. I think that's something for the shareholders to ultimately answer to. To your point where you started off about Vice President Harris's tax plan, which is disastrous, by the way, let's not forget how the conversation around income tax started in the early 20th century. It was the 16th Amendment, right? The 16th Amendment in 1913 that gave Congress the power to levy an income tax. And at the time, it was only applied to the upper echelon of workers. And we know now that everybody pays income tax. It's spread out. And so this idea that we would just start with people at the very high end, 100 million or more, that wouldn't slowly work its way down is not just ahistorical, but is antithetical to what the Democratic Party has shown time and again is what they want to do. To think that you would buy a home for $300,000, Nick, you're in the real estate world, and then it would appreciate to $400,000. You haven't sold it. You haven't done anything with it. And the government sends you a bill. Hey, you owe us 35 grand. Well, where's that money going to come from? Well, I don't know. You owe us 35 grand or you're going to prison. That's it. Let's not forget the IRS can charge you with a felony, can put you behind bars for defying their orders. And so there's a lot at stake here. And that is the one policy that Kamala Harris has mentioned that puts us in a Great Depression within 2 years.
Yeah, I think that one's a huge mistake. I don't know how that even got onto the focus list. One other point on the macro, we didn't really talk about inflation, but as a real estate player, I've noticed something interesting. One, I guess two things. One, for the bottom part of the K, everyone's celebrating, right? This victory lap, we defeated inflation. But the median or home in America is literally like $150,000 more than it was in 2020.
Right.
And it's completely out of reach for even more Americans. It was already out of reach. And so that isn't changing actually. The new level is devastating for standard of livings for Americans, households. And then the second thing, and I'm wondering what your take is as a macro analyst on this. What I'm noticing in my world is that there's massive outright deflation in real estate prices, in particular, multifamily rents, that is absolutely not getting picked up by the statistics. And it would be helpful, for example, to the Fed's mandate if it was picked up. We're seeing, like, just in our anecdotal, like our portfolio here in Atlanta or here in Los Angeles and in Atlanta, we're down like 20% easily from the peak. Like, that's a real number. It's not like the growth rate reduced. We're down 20%, and that isn't getting picked up in any of the statistics. Have you been tracking that or looking into that at all?
Absolutely. And what you're pointing out is what the live data shows, whether it's on Zillow or where have you, that the Fed is using BLS data that is lagging, right? Official rents, they have to take a year to kick in. You've got some price hikes that are still in the pike. And so the rents that are clearing the market today, Nick, and you, of course, know this well, are not consistent with the official data. Now, Chair Powell has said that he knows this. And so even though the official data suggests that rents are much higher than they actually are, that Chair Powell is already committed to starting this rate cutting cycle at the September meeting. And so I think it does yet again speak to this idea that, yeah, on one hand, you have prices that are in some cases higher and lower, but the official aggregate data, what you and I look at, what the Fed looks at, what economists look at, what the market's incessantly trading off of, doesn't often reflect reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for spending so much time. It's super interesting to pick your brain on this because I know you live and breathe it every day. Let's talk about Azoria for a second. This is a relatively new firm. Tell us what you're up to with Azoria.
Azoria is a investment firm that I'm building that's based on really three core values. The first is free thinking. We don't take anyone else's research at face value just because the herd is going this way. If we recognize that the herd is wrong, we're going to go this way no matter what the herd says. And so we don't take anything at face value. We don't take anything for granted. Everything that we do, we have rigorously and independently researched on our own. So free thinking is the first. The second is meritocracy. Our firm and the companies that we invest in are meritocratic. It's not about being of a certain gender or race. That's not how you move in or how you make an investment, but that's how you end up setting yourself up for failure. These companies that have committed themselves, Nick, to hiring thousands of workers, tens of thousands of workers on the basis of race, of skin color, of gender alone is a disastrous mistake. And those companies are going to pay the price long term by making their workforces less competitive, by seeing higher turnover, and by ultimately bearing the financial cost associated with those risks. And so meritocracy is key. And I'll talk about our first ETF being based on that logic. And the last one is excellence. We don't, if the markets are down, if the S&P is down 5% next year and we're only down 3%, that is not acceptable for us. Excellence for us is objective and absolute. And so how we think about our performance is not relative to any particular benchmark. If that benchmark is down 10% and we're only down 2%, not good. If we're up 8% and the market's up 10%, we're not beating ourselves either. We're thinking about excellence as an objective, absolute metric, not trying to compare ourselves based on some meaningless benchmark. And so what do all of these 3 core values lead us to is our first exchange traded fund next year. It's called the US Meritocracy ETF, Nick. And what it is we take the top companies in the S&P 500 that are committed to meritocracy. We exclude those that are committed to using shareholder money for woke social engineering. And let's see how those perform. Let's see how a basket of our stocks that are committed to meritocracy perform relative to the stocks that are committed to doing the opposite perform. And ex ante, if you knew nothing, you would guess that companies that say things like, we are going to hire the most qualified person no matter who it is, are going to outperform, be more competitive, and deliver more shareholder value than the companies who say, we are going to hire the next Black lesbian who walks in no matter what. That is completely unacceptable. You can have a diverse workforce. Diversity is not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It is a thing. But diversity is not a means to an end. As an end, it's absolutely 100% fine. Look at the US women's gymnastics team. You see so many different ethnicities and backgrounds there. Yet every single woman on that team went through a rigorous, unapologetic, meritocratic process to be on the Olympic team and to be competing in Paris. And yet you have Sung Lee and you have Simone Biles and you have everyone in between in terms of the traditional diversity metrics. And yet it was a rigorous, ruthless meritocratic process. And so this is to say, a lot of people are rightly upset that their retirement money, that their kids' college money is not just being unethically and immorally invested in this woke social engineering. But apart from that, these are bad investments. These investments are going to lose you money. And we have evidence, Nick, that these investments have already substantially underperformed their meritocratic peers. And so our first ETF coming out in 2025, the Azoria US Meritocracy Fund, is built on the idea that companies that are committed to hiring the best and not apologizing for it are going to outperform their peers that compel themselves to these mandatory hiring quotas based on race, gender, and what have you.
And what's the current dispersion, right? Like if you looked at the Dow 30 or the S&P 500, what percentage of companies would qualify for the meritocracy fund and what would not?
That's a good question. It depends how you measure it. So put it to you this way. Every single company in the S&P 500 has a DEI department, every single one. And so it's not a question of DEI. Like, is DEI a bad thing? I would argue yes. But it's a reality you have to accept if you're investing on terms of merit, right? I think the idea of an affinity group is boneheaded, right? That we have the Jews at Google and the Hispanics at Google, and we have the blacks at Google, and they somehow get together every Friday for drinks, and they're separated as opposed to working together and recognizing that we're all Americans, we're all Google employees, and we're trying to move this company forward. Sadly, that is present and ubiquitous in corporate America today. And so the test has to be one that largely is going to really show and indicate that these companies are going to punish themselves and their shareholders. So I think the test that we've come up with at Azoria is pretty straightforward. It's not one that all companies meet, but a sufficient number of them do. And that is, have you committed yourself to mandatory, not a suggestion, not a recommendation, a mandatory obligation to hire a certain percentage or to grow by a certain percentage your workforce, not based on talent, not based on merit, based on other things. And by the way, any constraint, Nick, is a bad thing. If Google came out tomorrow and said, we're going to hire 40% professors, why? Why? Professors don't have practical insight into artificial intelligence or into finance that might be required on the Google team. If you said we're going to hire 40% of people who are left-handed, why would that portend any sort of advantage, competitive advantage for your company? We're going to hire 40% of people who are really good at running marathons. What on earth does that have to do with Google Gemini or Google AdWords or Google Cloud? And so it's not even so much about diversity, although it's awfully toxic and divisive. It's more so to do, Nick, with this idea that it is yet another business constraint that binds business leaders and forces them to make suboptimal decisions that they actually don't bear the cost of, that shareholders, that everyday investors, whether you're a nurse in Coeur d'Alene or a firefighter in Cincinnati, that everyday investors in their retirement money, they're the ones who are stuck with the bag. They're the ones who are pay the price for this tokenization and this woke social engineering. And so we're committed to doing this. We'll be launching this low-cost ETF. The symbol has already been reserved by the exchange. It's MERT. Of course, follow me on X and LinkedIn or wherever, and we're going to push out updates as we get closer and closer. But I'm really excited about this. No one on the market is doing this. And we're going to take this message and this investment approach to all Americans. I've been criticized for, not being so polite to the so-called institutional investors, to the big hedge fund managers. I couldn't care less. We have to build a movement of investors. We know the power of retail. We know the power of everyday Americans. They saw this inflation. They felt this inflation before the Fed saw, recognized, and acted upon this inflation. And so let's build an investment company, a movement that actually helps them outperform the market based on something that's really not all that controversial called meritocracy.
And the test that you referenced that as you guys came up with at Azoria, what are the numbers on that? Like, how many companies have committed themselves to stuff like that?
Yeah. So right now we've found more than 24 companies that have committed themselves to these mandatory hiring quotas. They're just hiring quotas. And by the way, forget diversity. I mean, I don't even want to dignify it by calling it diversity because it sounds like it's a good thing. It's a mandatory hiring quota. Irrespective of what that quota is, business binding themselves to anything other than we are going to make money and pass that on to our shareholders is not a good thing. And so again, I say, well, 40% of our new employees should be vegetarians. Why? Why would you want to make that a quota? 40% of our new employees should know how to swim. Guys, this is Pepsi. We're not swimming in the product. Why is that a binding quota? 40% must be fluent in some archaic Greek language. Well, unless you're selling stuff and doing research in this language, it doesn't make any sense to pat yourself on the back and try to feel good about any hiring quota. Now, the only one that's applied now, of course, is diversity. So that's the one that we're going to attack, and we're going to attack it vociferously.
And when you say attack it, what do you mean by that? Just like not invest in those companies?
Yeah, I think a lot of conservatives, there's been a big part of the movement for a long time that has said we're gonna wag our finger and we're gonna write op-eds and we're gonna put out tweets about this company and we're gonna write public letters to the board. At some point, Nick, you say enough is enough. We're going to take our money out. We're not going to vote with a letter. We're going to vote with our feet. We're not going to let you destroy the retirement savings of millions of Americans, and we're going to invest money in companies like NVIDIA, like Palantir, like the list goes on, that have actually committed themselves to true, unapologetic meritocracy. And by the way, that oftentimes does mean swallowing your pride on things like an affinity group or a DEI initiative or a DEI department. Those things I roll my eyes at. I think there's a lot of reason to say that companies shouldn't do those things, but they're not going to ultimately have the kind of real, tangible business impact, whether that's on quality of workforce, competitiveness, labor training cost, turnover, that a mandatory DEI requirement hiring quota would. And so we have to separate the signal from the noise. Yeah, I'm not happy that Apple recently had an entrepreneurs boot camp where white men need not apply and where any men that are outside of a certain minority group need not apply. But ultimately, let's be honest, that's going to have little to no impact, zero impact actually, on what Apple does in the next 10 years. If a company like Nordstrom comes out and says 40% of executive management is going to be people of color, I don't care, by the way, and I don't think anybody should, that 40% of Nordstrom management ends up being people of color. Of course, that's almost too obvious to state, so long as all of those applicants are subjected to a rigorous meritocratic process. It's not the issue here. And people say, I think the left wants to mischaracterize this position and says, well, you want to keep minorities out of positions of power to keep up your privilege structures. There's nothing more demonizing to a so-called minority, really to a young black man from Morehouse or a young black woman who went to Howard, to say, the only reason you're being interviewed, the only reason, Nick, that you're getting the job is because of your skin color. There's nothing more demonizing for that young woman to walk in as an engineer and everyone whisper behind her back, she's here for one reason and one reason only, and that's because our company has a hiring quota. That defiles her dignity as an American. It strips away her purpose as a worker. It is wrong, full stop, period, end of story. And so this fight is primarily from the standpoint of an investment firm looking to help investors make as much money as possible. They've given us their hard-earned money, we hope, and we're going to grow that money into some more money. But it's also built on the idea that we hope that by shining a light on this, by investors moving away from investment funds that invest no matter what, whether there's hiring quotas or not, that put their money in the Meritocracy Azoria fund, that will send a strong signal. And that I think that in the first couple of years, I hope that if we start with 25 companies that are excluded from our index, that goes to 24 and then drops to 22 and drops to 19. And I would want nothing more, Nick, that in 10 years' time, that you and I to be catching up in Los Angeles over a little place called In-N-Out Burger. I do the 2x2. It's a great deal. To be able to tell you the Meritocracy Fund has wound down and has now transitioned to a full-blown equal weight S&P fund, because every company in that index has transitioned back to hiring people on their talent, their skill, their expertise, and not their skin color. It may not be good for our business, that's okay, but it'll be good for America, and I hope our investors will stick around for that. And in the next 10 years, if that's the case, purely hypothetical, I'm confident we're going to deliver them outperformance because we're investing in companies that are hiring the best of the best and not apologizing for it.
Interesting. And what are the other products you're planning for Azoria?
So there's a whole suite of them. We're looking at launching 3 ETFs over the next 18 months, Meritocracy being our first and our flagship product. But we want to look very carefully at certain economic success stories. Look at what President Javier Milei is doing in Argentina. His radical, we usually talk about radical in terms of socialism or communism or leftism, but it's a radical agenda that is based on the free market, that is based on the idea that no, the government isn't the solution, the government is the problem. That Argentina was one of the wealthiest countries on this planet in the early 20th century. And because of leftist government interference, and that alone was rendered into third world status. I got to meet Javier Milei backstage with Vivek at a conference earlier this year, where I actually got to translate for them a little bit in my mother's native tongue of Spanish. And when I was talking to President Milei and hearing their conversation with Vivek, this guy's the real deal. The economic data is already showing it. You talk to businesses, you look at the Argentinian markets. I think there's a real case for millions of Americans, whether they're conservative, independent, libertarian, or even a Democrat, who look at what's happening in Argentina, look at how special the Argentinian people are and how their economy is, with the shock therapy that Javier Milei is bringing to give them an opportunity to directly invest in that market. That's another fund I'd love to be able to launch here in the near future.
That's interesting. Yeah, it seems like a lot of times, historically at least, the sort of radical victories of the right have led not to free markets and libertarianism, but to just a different form of state-controlled capitalism, right? Like
Right.
in the World War II era, it's just taking over the means of production for national purposes. And this attempt right now in Argentina looks like a genuine move to try to eliminate government from the scene as much as possible. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
That's right. And it's an experiment. And like any experiment, Nick, there's going to be bumps in the road. There's going to be setbacks. But if the past 8 months have been any indication of what Javier Milei is going to do for Argentina, the best is yet to come. As he told Vivek backstage, make Argentina great again. And you do that by recommitting to unapologetic free market capitalism.
Yeah. Tell me about Incubate Debate.
So, interesting way to transition, because free market capitalism is actually a really good segue. I was a high school debater, did it in high school from 2009 to 2013. It totally changed my life. I was suffering from a speech impediment, from a stutter. I couldn't get a word out because I'd stutter over the first several words in a sentence. And that really dented my confidence. And I was thrown on the debate team in high school. And next thing I know, Nick, I'm reading Foreign Affairs, reading The Economist, reading the Financial Times, and debating what was happening in Europe, in the Middle East, and South America, and exposed to world events and domestic issues. And so high school debate was a life-changing experience for me. I went off to college, and when I came back from college, I wanted to give back in some small way to this activity that had given me a lot. And so I went to start a debate team at a Title I high school not too far from where I grew up. And it was at the first debate tournament I realized that high school debate had totally gone woke. It had totally been hijacked by left-wing politics. And in just 4 years, I had barely recognized the same debate that had changed my life. And the first tournament I went to, Nick, a adult debate judge at the end of the debate told my student who I was coaching, you would have won the round had you not called BLM a Marxist organization. This is a young black man calling Black Lives Matter a Marxist organization. Why? Because it is, and they actually make no secret of that. And so the idea that a judge would put their personal politics on the line to say that, in high school debate, the old adage was, may the best argument win. Now it was, may the best debater who conforms to my personal opinion win. And so this began 2 years of me seeing up close just how corrupted high school debate had gotten. And so in this free market system called the US, what I ended up doing was launching an alternative, a big believer in creative destruction, a big believer in parallel institutions. You don't just write op-eds and write tweets about how high school debate went woke. You have to give people an alternative. And that's what I did with Incubate Debate. Launched this in 2019 as an alternative. We've tripled the number of students in the past year to over 5,000. We're in Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia. As we speak, we're standing up new leagues in New York City, in Southern California, bringing in students from Mississippi, from Alabama, and Louisiana into our leagues as well. And so we want to bring real high school debate as it used to be to Americans, by the way, who may not have otherwise done debate. We do that not just by offering an alternative to the broken system, what I call legacy debate, but also by making it free, by bringing in really high quality judges like business owners and operators and elected officials and faith-based leaders and veterans and service members, but by making it really accessible for students. Our debate formats, we call them easy to learn, hard to master. Our debate topics are always relevant, urgent issues facing the country. Our students this fall are debating the assault weapons ban from 1994, which both President Biden and Vice President Harris have vocally supported in recent weeks. And so we want our students to debate urgent issues, recent issues, and do it in a format that looks and feels like the debates that are taking place across dinner tables and boardrooms every single day in America. And so Incubate is built on this idea of making debate great again, not just for students at our tournaments, but soon bringing this directly to classrooms. So teachers, whether they're having a lesson on World War II or talking about environmental science, can actually turn the subject matter. They typically turn it into a pop quiz or a short essay, but turn the subject matter into an engaging educational debate in the classroom. Environmental science teacher opens the floor to a debate about the benefits of wind versus solar, or nuclear versus fossil fuels, or a US history teacher who just taught a lesson on World War II, opening the floor for a debate for students about whether it was necessary for the US to drop the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end the war in 1945. And so making debate great again also means making debate as accessible to young Americans as possible. We're doing that at our tournaments with Incubate, and we're doing it soon with our Incubate Teacher Toolkit that will give the tools and confidence and skills to teachers to bring debate directly to their kids in the classroom.
Which I love this mission. We've been talking a lot about on the podcast about sort of the breakdown in civic discussion and civil discourse in this country. And I feel like Incubate Debate is a phenomenal idea to address this issue kind of where you need to, which is with the young people. And on one of your podcast episodes, I think you referred to the guiding principle as, the fostering the good faith clash of opposing views.
Right.
And I really like that phraseology. And I want to try to understand, because I think this sort of woke, anti-woke debate is one of those debates that we aren't actually having, because people tend to get emotional. If someone says, I'm against woke, then they stop listening. But what exactly was wrong what had gone wrong in those 4 years that caused you to start Incubate Debate? Like, how would you describe that in a way that fosters, civil discourse, like keeping on brand with the mission?
Yeah. I'm going to read directly because I can't even make this stuff up. And I think the best thing to do, as I learned as a high school debater, is be specific and use primary source evidence. So here is what the 2019 debate champion, national debate champion, Lila Lavender, told students before a debate round. She's judged hundreds of students every single year for the past 5 years. And this is an online website where students before the debate, Nick, will log on and see who's judging them and what their preferences are. Usually, these preferences are things like don't speak too quickly and present your evidence to me during the round so I can see what you're saying. They're not supposed to be political litmus tests, but here goes. I'm quoting verbatim what Lila Lavender, a prominent high school debate judge, tells students before debates. Quote, before anything else, including being a debate judge, I am a Marxist, Leninist, Maoist. I cannot check the revolutionary proletarian science at the door when I'm judging. I will no longer evaluate and thus never vote for rightist, capitalist, imperialist positions and arguments. Examples of arguments of this nature are as follows: fascism good, capitalism good, imperialist war good, neoliberalism good, defenses of the US, Zionism, normalizing Israel, colonialism good. And she goes on. Here's another example debate judge. Debate judge Shabum Gupta says, quote, if you are discussing immigrants in a round and describe the person as illegal, I will immediately stop the round, give you the loss with low speaks, and give you a stern lecture and then talk to your coach. I will not have you making the debate space unsafe. These are two of hundreds of judges, prominent high school active debate judges, who tell students before the debate, the Overton window has shrunk. You're allowed to debate. You're allowed to disagree, so long as you disagree within the confines of moderate leftism and far left leftism, so long as you disagree in the way in which I instruct you. That is not debate. And sadly, Nick, what we're seeing at high school debate outside of Incubate is a microcosm of what we're seeing in America. 60% of Americans, according to the Cato Institute, say that they don't feel comfortable saying in public what they believe because of political backlash. 63%, according to Heterodox Academy, of college students say they don't feel comfortable comfortable saying what they believe on a college campus. The way you measure, as my friend Vivek Ramaswamy says, the way you measure the health of civil discourse in our democracy is the percentage of people who are willing to say in public what they actually believe. That number is abysmally low today. And so make debate great again, although a clever play on Donald Trump's campaign, is really about making civility great again, making civil discourse great again, making asking questions great again, making disagreeing agreeably great again, and making the relentless pursuit of truth great again. And the pandemic, when Twitter 1.0 shut you down for asking questions about masks, they were not making debate great again. They were thwarting open debate and free speech. When a school board meeting shuts down a concerned mom about certain policies in effect in the district, they are shutting down debate. They are not making debate great again. When you or I instinctively, I don't want to speak for you, but I know that I'm guilty of it sometimes. When we shut down a friend for saying something before they even get a word out because the first sentence is so absurd that you can't even dignify it with a continued clash of ideas, I would not be making debate great again. And so making debate great again is just as much about us as Americans reinvigorating and revitalizing a culture of being able to ask questions and pursue truth, even if, by the way, it's uncomfortable at times. It's just as important that we, Nick, do that and we set a standard as it is for the government to get off our back, for social medias to get off our back, for college campuses to get off students' back and let them debate the issues of the day without fear or retribution. Debate is not something that should be punished. It should be celebrated on every college campus. It is a patriotic act, one, by the way, set in motion this very country's founding in 1776, began with a series of debates about whether it was actually wise to start this war and declare independence. That debate continued to the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787 about what a national government, what a federal government would look like in the wake of the feckless and weak federal government that had been established at the time. And so debate is at its core a patriotic act. That's good to do it for that reason. But it's also the greatest method we know in history to come to truth. We don't come to truth through some ministry run by the government that says that you're allowed to do this or that. Galileo knew that when he questioned the way we understood the thing called the solar system. And so debate, I think it's got to be front and center. It's got to be, and it absolutely is, a precondition for solving not just everything that afflicts us, but for solving the next generation of solutions to make our country and our world as great as we know it can be.
Yeah, when you think about debate, like in your day, let's say, how does a debate judge handle something like, let's assume that this is the pre-change, whenever that change happens. It happened sometime when you graduate, from the time you graduated high school to when you came back to do it. In the pre-change world, if you're on a debate stage and you engage in speech that is offensive, let's say, what happens to you in that scenario back then?
So nothing, right? I mean, let's talk about what they think is offensive. Saying Israel has a right to defend itself, they consider offensive because you're supporting, in their mind, genocidal Israel. That would just be, you make an argument about Israel and then I have an opportunity to respond. My opponent has an opportunity to respond. Let's say someone says illegal immigrant. Well, that is that's a racial slur in the traditional legacy world of high school debate. And so the way I would respond, and by the way, any student is free to respond to that. I have no issue. I believe that if you entered the country illegally, that you are an illegal immigrant. Some may disagree with me. That's okay. But you know what I welcome is, if you disagree with speech, censorship is never the answer. It's your own speech that is the answer to countering speech that you disagree with. And I'll tell you, this actually happened in an Incubate tournament. A student used the word illegal alien to describe illegal aliens in a debate about President Trump's border wall. And a student went up there and said, I take issue with how you use this and allow me to criticize your arguments accordingly. That's it. That's how you handle it. Let's not get the adults in the room involved. Let's not get them censoring. Let's not set up speech codes to punish students for not saying what someone arbitrarily thinks is politically correct. If someone at Incubate Debate has issue with what someone else says, we say very simply, you're not going to take your report in on what you think was offensive. If you find something offensive or politically incorrect, you can, in your speech time, the way you have the floor, the way they had the floor, you can bring that to folks' attention. And ultimately, just as they had their mantle, just as they had their platform to speak, you do as well. And so I think that what the adults in the room can do at this time when it comes to young people in civil discourse and debate is let young people be young people. Let them make mistakes. Let them get offended. Let them offend others. And let that free market creative destruction process work on its own. Obviously, there are things that are offensive. Or is there anything that's really all that offensive to the point where you would want to humiliate a student and disqualify them as these judges are advocating for? I don't think so. But at the end of the day, our policy at Incubate Debate is if there is speech that is protected by the First Amendment, if there is speech that is protected by the First Amendment, there is no reason that that same speech would not be protected by our standards at Incubate Debate.
Okay, interesting. I was interviewed a Professor Eugene Volokh, who is a longtime UCLA law school professor and a First Amendment expert. And I was preparing for that interview and listening to a bunch of First Amendment podcasts, and I forget who brought it up. I thought it was actually Volokh, but it ended up not being him. So in the middle of the interview, I kind of misquoted him, and I think he got mad at me. But that's another story. But basically, what I heard in my research was that basically on college campuses in particular, the free speech debate changed from, in the 60s, it was essentially young people pushing for the right to exercise their First Amendment rights, being able to say whatever they wanted to say, whether it meant, death to America and American military, is engaging in murder, all these sort of controversial statements at the time. And fast forward to the modern era, what we saw during the last, graduation cycle is almost the opposite, which is college students were fighting to prevent other people from saying things. It's like the whole script had gotten flipped. And I thought that was fascinating. And I wonder, you've been engaged in this in a serious way. Like, how do you think that happened? Like, what exactly changed in our culture to where the whole debate on free speech flipped in that direction?
It is such a good question. And you're absolutely right in your framing that in the 1960s, it was the free speech movement in places like UC Berkeley, in particular in 1964, that where students were occupying buildings. Why? Why were they occupying buildings in 1964? Because they wanted more speech, because their campuses were banning on-campus political activities, were restricting students' rights to advocate for civil rights and to speak out about issues that they cared about. And now students at Columbia are occupying buildings because their administration will not censor students enough, will not go far enough in some cases to censor the speech of others. And so there's a multitude of causes here. It happened gradually and then suddenly, as Ernest Hemingway once said to describe bankruptcy. But there's no question that there have been phases in our country where anti-free speechism, censorship, anti-debatism have prevailed. And I want to make a distinction, by the way, between free speech and open debate. Open debate is a subset of free speech, but free speech is not necessarily part of open debate. I'll give you an example. When the neo-Nazis in 1977 wanted to march through Skokie, Illinois, which included a large Jewish population, home of many Holocaust survivors, we learned in 1978 in the Supreme Court case, National Socialist Party v. the Village of Skokie, that speech was, of course, protected. That is, despite how repulsive and offensive and despicable it was still protected, and it should be. protected by the First Amendment. That is speech. That speech was not intended to spark some debate about the Holocaust or to spark some debate, heaven forbid, about whether it happened or some greater debate in the community. It was simply speech and speech alone, speech as a means to an end. Open debate, Nick, as I'm researching and really honing in on for this book that I'm writing, appropriately titled Make Debate Great Again, is a means to an end. And that end is truth. And so when you had students in the 1960s and 70s clamoring for more speech, pushing back against the administration's censorship, they were using debate and speech as a method to get to truth about the Vietnam War, about civil rights, about the rights afforded to Black Americans in the 1960s. Rights, by the way, that were largely a betrayal of the promises made in the wake of the Civil War. And so that was a method as opposed to an act of speech on its own. You remember the famous water buffalo episode, right? In the 90s, where that student would shouted from his dorm room to a young Black sorority saying, "Shut up, you water buffalo," and was quickly punished by the university for doing that. I think that was wrong to punish that student for that. But that was an instance of speech, not an instance of open debate. And so obviously speech is important, but what we see as a problem today as I'm writing in this book is the gravest and most pervasive form of censorship. By the way, one censorship that is apolitical because it punishes the left oftentimes just as much as it does the right, although right now it's punishing the right a heck of a lot. The most pervasive form of censorship, Nick, in America and in the West today is not the censorship of a particular thought, but of a method, of a process. And that process is open debate. You weren't allowed to ask your school board certain questions, to exchange ideas about certain important issues during the pandemic. You weren't allowed to engage in a good faith debate on Twitter or Facebook about election integrity in the wake of the 2020 election, or about mask mandates or vaccine mandates in the wake of the pandemic, just as you were in 2003, not allowed to engage in a substantive good faith debate about whether or not it was wise to invade Iraq, just as you were not to engage in a good faith debate in 1917 and 1918 about the merits of entering World War I. There was actual legislation that was put in place to punish people for publishing letters and making speeches that were critical of the war. Those speeches, Nick, were not speeches for the sake of speeches, as opposed to just the idea of free speech, as opposed to Skokie. They were speeches as an act of patriotism in a means to an end, and that end was truth. That end was some sort of reconciliation, some sort of resolution to grapple with the issue at the time, whether that was World War I, whether that was the Civil Rights Act, whether that was Vietnam, whether that was the invasion of Iraq, whether that was the pandemic, whether that was the 2020 election. We need to stop fearing. We need to stop fearing this idea of open debate. Open debate is the greatest method in history. It really underpins the scientific method as a matter of fact. And so oftentimes you hear, whether it's even around the dinner table, someone scoff, don't bring that up. No, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to have a conversation. And they may never use the word, Nick. And that's why I say I define debate as the clash of opposing viewpoints. They may never use the word debate, but so long as there are people who are offering arguments on either side of any issue, and those arguments are clashing, that is a debate. Whether it's in a college classroom where you're not allowed apparently to question the efficacy of diversity programs, or where in the case of a young girl last year who uses the word biological sex in a paper to push back on the notion of transgenderism, gets punished, gets flunked by her professor. That is a form of debate. It is using speech as a means to an end, and that end is truth. And so that is a long-winded way of saying, make debate great again. It made this country great, and our best days are still ahead of us so long as we embrace something called open debate, the questioning of any idea at any time. There's no such thing. There can be no such thing as a settled issue.
Yeah. You might already be clued into this, but just in case you're not, I do think there is a profound relationship between the idea of speech and truth.
Yeah.
And my father's from Greece, so I have like a special affinity, and Socrates is obviously my favorite thinker. But that is one of his main points, is like
Yeah.
the way that you arrive at an idea of the truth is through discourse back and forth.
That's right.
And if you can't do that honestly, in Socrates' views, brutally honest, he was like really like to the point where he was in people's faces about it. But if you can't do it honestly, you can't arrive at the truth. And I think that's true. I think Socrates was onto something. It's dangerous, right? Like he got himself killed for advocating for that level. But there is this relationship, and our founders knew it, and they codified it in the Constitution on purpose.
Correct.
Because it's so important. If you can't have this conversation about policy without the fear of social loss or legal loss in some cases, then what can you do? Well, how can democracy even function? And we've gotten it's gotten so backwards. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Like, I was thinking that we may have reached the high watermark of this, like in the COVID era. Like you see Zuckerberg recently kind of stepping back from the earlier positions that they had taken at Facebook and basically apologizing. Like, I think we've reached high watermark and maybe headed in the other direction back towards freedom. But what's your take?
That, well, if we've reached the high watermark, effectively, if we've plateaued, it doesn't necessarily mean that we are back to where we need to be. And so I applaud what Mark Zuckerberg did. A little too late, to tell you the truth. I mean, these things should have never happened in the first place, but we'll take a win for what it is. There's some semblance of contrition there and recognition of what went wrong. But I think we've seen the worst of it. We can't rest on our laurels, but having seen the worst of it, if we truly have top ticked the censorship index, we shouldn't take any pride in that. We shouldn't take any pride until the number of Americans who can say what they actually believe in public is 100%. And that applies to the left just as would to the right. Look, if pro-Palestinian students are being violent, are blocking entrances, are preventing Jewish students from getting to class, that is abhorrent. It is illegal. It has absolutely no place on American college campuses. Yet, pro-Palestinian students who are peacefully expressing policy disagreements with Israel and President Biden's response and so on and so forth, even if I deeply disagree, I'm a proud Zionist. I'm a proud believer that Israel both has a right to exist and a right to defend itself. But I will defend the right of pro-Palestinian students to peacefully disagree with me, even if that language is offensive, even if, by the way, they say things that are false, because the only way, Nick, they can learn, they can be proven and disabused of these falsehoods and oftentimes this radicalism is through open debate. One of the cool benefits, it often isn't talked about in the free speech movement, is if somebody hates Jews, heaven forbid, or someone is a Holocaust denier, wouldn't you want free speech to be able to out them? Wouldn't you want a system where they actually feel comfortable airing those despicable ideas in public? So one, we know who they are, sleep with one eye open, watch your back. And two, so you can make an earnest attempt of disabusing them of this radical thinking. And that, I think that's at the heart of it. I got to criticize my own side recently, conservatives, for losing their mind over the Osama bin Laden letter to America and wanting it and going viral on TikTok and then wanting it censored by TikTok. And many conservatives said, look, this is unbelievable. It's un-American that bin Laden would go viral on TikTok. And obviously there's certain issues about TikTok being an echo chamber. Put those to the side for a sec, Nick. But the reality is, if you want to confront bin Laden and you want to get to the truth about who he was as a man, I'm sorry, we have to read Letter to America. And we have to have an open and honest discussion, not just about that piece of evidence, but all of the evidence about his activities leading up to September 11th, the attack on the USS Cole, his actions in Afghanistan, and this treatment of women and homosexuals and so on and so forth. And so the worst thing you could do if you wanted young people to be really radicalized by bin Laden is let his letter go viral for 48 hours and then pull it down and then validate many of them saying, wow, they know bin Laden's right. They don't want us to see the truth. Why not instead present students with, let's just say for simplistic purposes, Nick, two pieces of evidence: bin Laden's letter to America and then a direct refutation of that letter by some American scholar who has published and written on this, be it from the Hoover Institution or wherever. And then give students the bin Laden letter and a direct, substantive, line-by-line refutation of that letter. And then as the adult in the room, step back and let them discuss that. Let them, through that marketplace of ideas, prove one another and disprove one another. You and I know the truth. Bin Laden was a diabolical and evil man. Maniac even. But we can't impose that truth on the next generation. We have to use this time-proven method of open debate for young Americans to get to that truth. I believe, like President Reagan did, in this idea of informed patriotism, not the patriotism that slaps the kid on the wrist for not standing up for the pledge, not a patriotism that says, how dare you question the decision to drop the bombs on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. That was unapologetically a patriotic act. No, don't impose patriotism. Create a marketplace of ideas of informed patriotism, where every act, whether it's standing for the national anthem or standing for the Pledge of Allegiance, young Americans are doing that out of their own volition because they recognize what this represents. Our history is not perfect. Let's be completely honest. Yet at the same time, it is not the fake news history peddled by the likes of Nicole Hannah-Jones in the 1619 Project. There is good, there is bad, and there is ugly. Yet let young Americans come to truth on their own by reviewing a wide range of viewpoints from, yes, the likes of Howard Zinn, not a popular thing to say to conservatives, but also the likes of Thomas Sowell, also the likes of Ronald Reagan. Run the political spectrum, run the ideological spectrum. Students deserve no less than a wide range of viewpoints in education.
Yeah, man. Well said. And I like your vision of true north. I think that statistic you shared earlier about the percentage of people who are willing to share their true political beliefs in public, I think that's a really important number to track. And getting to a place where everyone felt comfortable is a great goal, because that's what it should be. I think a lot of Americans, regardless of their political persuasion, they forgot some history. Like, the extreme version of cancel culture is the Cultural Revolution in China, where you get killed for saying stuff. Like,
Yeah.
it's all good, it's all a thing to deplatform somebody from X. But the extreme version of this stuff is people get killed. And so we shouldn't dance with the devil on this. And I believe in civil discourse and free speech, and appreciate the work that you're doing. And I'm looking forward to checking out the book when it comes out. Thanks for spending so much time with us today, man. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It's an honor.